Good afternoon. My name is Jim Butler. I am the teacher for Philosophy of Religion. I am glad that you are joining the class. I do understand we have 3 students. I do understand that one of you all was from the field last night and the other person just happened to forget about being there, but that's okay. This time I'm going to do the lecture on video and send it out to you all via your email. Now, I will tell you this, there are only 3 students in the class. So what I'm asking you is, if you cannot be there for some reason, if there's one week you cannot be there, I'm asking you to please please email me or text me. My telephone number is 270-200-3582. My email is profjim@gmail.com. That's profjim@gmail.com. That way I will know if 2 people are going to be gone, only one person is going to be there, that we might be able just to do it online again. I will be sending you a syllabus of the class, as well as all of the necessary stuff that you need to get kind of acquainted with, also an outline, or if you will, an outline of the classes themselves and what we're going to be studying on each given night. So tonight, or this afternoon, right now, we're going to talk about the introduction to the philosophy of religion, and then we're also going to start with chapter 1 and talk about the existence and necessity, if you will. Now, let's talk for a minute about an introduction to, if you will, to philosophy of religion. Philosophy of religion seems to have emerged somewhere in the early or the middle part of the 20th century. At least at that time, it grew exponentially, and to me, that is somewhat deceiving. Philosophical reflection and religious themes have truly been a part of philosophy from early days till the present time. The study may not be new, but there have been lots and lots of questions raised through the modern times. Many of the questions philosophers have asked are questions that have been asked from the very beginning of time. Is there a God? Okay, is there a God? If there is a God, how can God permit evil? Number 3, does morality depend on God? And many other questions can actually come to mind about these things. Almost every human culture has had some form of religious practices. Almost every human culture has seen a higher being in their religious beliefs, and that higher being was held in the highest esteem. Pantheism, Pantheism, is one belief. And that is the belief that God exists in all things. God exists in nature. God exists in rocks. God exists in trees and rivers and everything else. Others believe that God is different or separate from his creation. Many believe that God exists as a body form. It's called panentheism, Panentheism. In Western theology, or in Western belief, we hold to the truths of supernatural beings, angels, demons, God himself is the supreme being, perfect beings. All these help to control all that exists. Although there are many religions in the world, and I do teach another class called World Religions, for this particular class, we will focus, if you will, on the 3 major religions, and that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There are some questions that can be raised. There are many approaches that can be taken in all of these studies about the concept of religion. Some Islamic theologians try to piece together a God based on the way God is described in and through the Quran, which is their Bible, if you will. Others in all other major religions see God more in the ideal of creation and the design that God must exist. because God has shown us the design itself. This is called natural theology. Scholars have long held, and discoverers who especially have studied religion have held the concept of God and his behavior and his practices of those who believe. There are various forms of philosophy: philosophy of art, philosophy of science, philosophy of law, philosophy of psychology. So therefore, there is also this philosophy of religion. There are two very basic words used for this type of study. One is conceptual clarification, and the other is propositional clarification. The philosophy of religion explores what is meant by the word God with a big G. Are the meanings of God coherent? Should one even accept, if you will, the existence of God? Western monotheistic religious traditions claim, at least in a rough sense, that there is a shared concept of God between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The problem, and the biggest problem in the theistic philosophy of religion, is to analyze and explore, if you will, the concept of God. How do we unpack the concept of God? Is there such a tremendous, among the three religions, there is such a tremendous concept of God himself? The concept of God is characterized in a variety of different ways. For some, God is just an ultimate reality. He is just, if you will, the source of everything. For others, God is the maximal, perfect being. Others would say that God is the one and only being who is worthy of worship. And there are two different ways to use the word God with a big G. It can be used as a proper name, or it may be a title, or it could be both. Now, let me give you an example of that. Ronald Reagan, and some of you all may not even remember Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, but Ronald Reagan alone is a proper name and an individual. He was the president of the United States. The person, which is the proper name, Ronald Reagan, president of the United States, he was fulfilling a certain purpose or a certain position. When God is used as a name, it can refer to an individual, a specific individual, or God can be a specific title. This is who God is, and this is what God does. If God is used as an individual, then we need to unpack some very specific information about that individual. God as a title stands on its own merits. There are basically two traditions or approaches on how we unpack the concept of God and how it's developed. One is posteriori. I'm going to spell that for you. It's kind of a strange word. Posteriori. It begins with data. It begins with data and gives people a direct contact with the individual, God, not flesh and blood, but not always flesh and blood. That's posteriori. Data came from revered texts when we talk about this one. Religious experiences, prophets, and then they built this concept of God from the information that was given to them. There are the people who speak of God, both in the Bible and in the Quran, referring, if you will, to a particular individual. Priori, Priori, begins with the very basic characteristics, okay, and the features. People here would say, for God to be God, he had to be the creator of all things. For something to count as God, it must be worthy of worship. For something to be God, it must be grounded in morality. In the Western world and in Western theistic tradition, there is something of careful negotiations between these two methods. The word God can certainly be a proper name, since theists do believe there is a unique individual who people can become acquainted with through religious experiences. On the other hand, revelation and reason sometimes describes God as an entity who plays roles. For example, in the Hebrews, God is creator. Go all the way back to the book of Genesis. God is creator. He's the first cause of all that is. In Western theism, there's a connection between title and function. God, after all, is a proper title, but whereas President of the United States is only a title for only an individual to fill that particular position at a particular time. Almost all theistic religions, almost all theistic traditions agree on the following basic claims about God. Nothing made God. Nothing made God. And God is the source or ground of everything that is not God. Number two, God rules over everything that is not God. Number three, God is the most perfect being. Now, when you put together these 3 points, we get a very basic and we get a better concept or a richer concept of who God is and what we think about God. Now, there are 3 starting points that actually have labels. There's creation theology. Creation theology. Then there's providential theology. And then there's perfect being theology. Creation theology says that God was not made, but rather he was the maker of all things. There are other things we can learn about God when we see God through this light, that God was never made, he was always. That is, that God is a being with unlimited power, that God is a rational being, that God is a being of ultimate intelligence. Providential theology says that God is the supreme among all created things. Therefore, it can be concluded as well that God continues to sustain the world's existence. And also God continues to care for and be involved in the activities of all that he has created. And then there's perfect being theology. Theology plays a huge role in the Western theistic traditions, Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Perfect being theology, when it comes to philosophy, goes all the way back to Plato, who identifies God as a supreme reality. He refers to him as the good. It comes through Aristotle, who refers to God as the best substance. 3 traditions converged and were influential on some of the following theologians in their respective religions. Philo and Maimonides, Maimondides, were very helpful in Judaism. Al-Kindi and Avicenna were influential in Islam. Augustine, Anselm, Thomas Aquinas were very helpful in the Christian faith. Anselm is perhaps the one who had the greatest influence and believed that God was the greatest of all possible beings in the universe. Perfect being theology has to claim that something is God only if it can display great making properties. So what are great making properties? Obvious. They're properties that can make something great. But the problem comes from this. Some properties are great making only in the context of certain things. Being tall can make someone a great basketball player, but not good to be a horse jockey. Does it need to be confined to certain properties? You have to think about that. Thomas Morris said that great making qualities are relative to 2 broad types of goodness, intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic qualities examples means earning a living is good because it leads to being happy. But why is being happy important? It is important because it allows us to buy something. Happiness is good all by its own. With intrinsic qualities, we might be able to say that God is personal. God has wisdom. God has knowledge. God has power. And God has moral excellence. These qualities are not something that can bring God something, but rather simply having them makes God intrinsically good. God is good. Extrinsic qualities bring about other good things. Example of that, a tall basketball player is able to shoot above everybody else because they're unhindered. For the same reason, they're able to rebound better. But being tall in and of itself does not make a good quality. But being tall allows the player to make more points and win the game and secure the job and so on. Now, there tends to be another problem about all this. The choice of great making properties are subject to culture. Defenders of perfect theology teach that fundamental ideas of God are necessity. How one chooses to believe in God may be culturally biased. Depends on where you were raised. It may be based on your culture. But religious institutions are not hunches or gut feelings. In truth, the belief goes far deeper than that. Beliefs based on intuitive truths or foundational truths help us to gain a stronger grasp on what we believe. It is believed by most that as human beings we are intrinsically good. I believe that we are intrinsically good and we have a moral worth. To think differently. To them, it is wrong to torture someone for fun. On the other hand, it is good to help others in need. I believe that with all my heart. Intuition about anything, including some of our beliefs about God, may be subject to correction. In other words, our belief, if we're thinking in the wrong direction, our belief might be wrong. What we believe about God based on intuition may be truly found to be false. This valuable intuition may also be only be able to take us so far in our understanding of God. Let's talk about perfect theology. That raises some questions also, raises some issues in my mind also. Can a loving, all-caring God, how can that person or being be truly unchangeable? Can a being who exercises knowledge and power be outside of time and also be independent? That raises some questions. Some would say that say or define God as possessions, all great making properties. Some would also argue that not all great making properties can be composed in one place or in one person. It is held that a higher being, not all may be compatible. For example, one cannot be married and yet be a bachelor at the same time. Of course, the problem here is that we're using human terms to describe a God. Let's talk about self-existence and necessity. Anselm says everything that exists falls into three categories. Things that are explained by others, things that are self-explaining, and things that are not explained about at all, or things that are explained by it that cannot be explained by anything. Anselm felt that nothing could fall into category 3. If this is true, then God is either self-explaining or explained by another. Classical theists believe that God is self-explaining. Now, what do we mean by that? Think about the Grand Canyon. I've never been there. I've always wanted to go, but think about the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon could not or would not exist if there were no water on earth to create rivers. These rivers last long enough to cause widespread erosion. And if none of these had held true, there would be no Grand Canyon. This seems to leave a thing of beauty at the existence of many contingencies. Some would contend that self-explaining, like in the existence of God, borders on the incoherent or the unreasonable. A explains the existence of another titled B. This is only true when A causes B, but for A to cause B, then A has to pre-exist. The writer says this shows nothing can explain itself since it would require something that pre-exists itself. God is identical with his nature. There can't be more than one thing with divine nature, and so divine nature exists only if God exists. So that raises the question, why does God exist? Because divine nature exists. Because God exists, divine nature exists. Let's talk about God's omnipotence or perfect power. Central to theistic concepts of God, there's a notion that God has maximal power. Maximal power, what is referred to as maximal power, is omnipotence, Omnipotence. Omnipotence is God's power to create things. It's God's power to sustain all things. It's his power to give power to the limitations to those under God. There are those who argue against this type of belief in omnipotence. Now, what do they mean by that? They raise the question, can God create a rock that is so big that he can't lift it? Most would consider this a silly question. But if you look at it again from the point, there's no matter which way the question is answered, it's a problematic thing about omnipotence. Some would consider God's making and lifting powers as being separate. Then we might also conclude that God's lifting powers is unlimited and God's rock-making power is also unbounded. That's why we might conclude that God's creating and lifting powers are unlimited. Some would simply define it as the ability to do anything. Omnipotence is the ability to do anything. But again, that sort of simplifies it too much. There are people-made analogies that quickly point out things that God cannot do. God cannot create married bachelors. He cannot create round squares. He cannot cause necessary existing behaviors not to exist. These are human-made analogies. There are philosophers, there are theologians who resist the idea that God can do the logically impossible. Descartes and the Cartesian view of omnipotence is this: God is not limited by anything. Hear that again. God is not limited by anything. Others who disagree with Descartes say that the laws of logic are not limitations at all. There's the view that omnipotence is the power to do anything logically possible to do. This is the definition of omnipotence. But there is something we need to remember. God can choose to do or not to do everything and anything, period. Talk about God's goodness. Classical theists believe that God is perfectly and morally good. Explanation: never acting immorally. God never falls short of the standards of perfect morality. To this thought, God is perfectly and morally good if, in fact, God does not fall short of relevant moral standards. Classic theists believe this, that God never falls short of the moral mark. And that's called moral perfection. It's also called impeccability. To deny God's impeccability is to say that God can do wrong and God can do no wrong. Now, there is an argument. That's an argument that I cannot adhere to. If God is impeccable, then there are some things that God cannot do. God cannot lie. God cannot break promises. God cannot murder. God cannot do, etc., etc., etc. But what if in the imagination there is a being who has all of God's powers, is able to do what God cannot do? God cannot murder, lie, break promises, etc. If such a being is possible, then wouldn't that being exceed God's powers? There's another way of looking at that. To say one has maximum power and perfect goodness cannot have the power to do evil. To use the phrase, the power to do evil, is to show there's a distinct power to do that. Talk about, raise your fingers. Basketball players do it to call, you watching basketball, they raise their fingers to call a play. But you might raise your finger for a bid at an auction, or you might raise one finger in a very inappropriate gesture. To apply this to God, we might note God has the power and God chooses not to do some things. Let's talk about creation and conservation and providence. Classical theists agree that God's power is great enough to give him the ability to create all things and the ability to maintain all things. Some theists have believed that God's creating activity consists of just moving around some things. He just shifted things around a little bit. They already were in existence. He just kind of, I guess if you will, that might be like the Big Bang Theory. Plato believed God simply sorted out pre-existing realities. Theists believe that God created ex nihilo, or out of nothing, no pre-existing materials. Scientists and others point to the fact that the universe is infinitely old. Does that mean the universe with no exact beginning implies that God did not create it? No. Theists hold to the truth that God did create, that God sustains the creation moment by moment. Descartes says nothing in all of creation guarantees the existence for one more moment. Someone else guarantees this. Descartes says it's God. Descartes argues for divine activity. Even if the universe were without a beginning, God would still be the creator. God's existence and activity sustains creation from moment to moment. Classic theists also believe that God is involved with everything that happens. It's called divine concurrence. Thomas Aquinas believed in divine concurrence. God would be able to know what a creature would do and how they would act. But if God knows what a creature will do, why doesn't God move to prevent them from happening? If God can prevent them from doing something that they know is wrong, then why don't he stop them from doing it? It's called choice. At that point, all choice would be out of the creature's hands and it would be in the hands of God. And God would be pulling like puppets on a string. There would be no choice at all. And creation would simply do what God says. There would be no freedom whatsoever. Occasionalism came from a 17th century philosopher by the name of Nicholas, Malebranche, belief that God acts and has committed to act when there are certain occurrences in the world. In other words, if something happens, God's going to act. But if nothing happens, God's not going to act. But if this were true, genuine free actions would have no place in creation. If occasionalism were true, every event in the universe is brought about directly by God. And if this were true, one would expect that there would be no evil in the world, right? But theism confronts evil. We believe that God does not create evil. Theists believe that God does not create evil, but rather he permits evil. God permits evil. If God permits evil rather than causing evil, then occasionalism, the thought of its occasionalism cannot stand. If there is the concept of deism, the belief there is a creator brought the world into existence, but only casually connected with the creation, that's not in effect at all. Theists believe that God is absolutely and perfectly good. God is faultless and maximally loving and benevolent. It is divine goodness that leads to the theist to believe that God is worthy of worship. God's being worthy of worship is divine and central to the attributes of God. Some people believe worship of God is done more out of dogma or by ego. But, we do worship because God is an egomaniac, and he says we have to worship. Classic theists believe that God is worshipped not because of fear or because of demand. They worship because God is good. God is worthy of worship. Now, I want to read from the book for just a second. It's all about tension, and the first tension, if you will. It's on page 27. There's 1.6 and 1.7. Since our world exists, either this is the best world, or it is among one of the other worlds that are tied for best. This number 1.7 says, to have morally significant freedom, one must be able to choose among alternatives of different moral quality. Interesting. And if I don't buy that argument, at all. God may have the opportunity, but because God is totally good, God does not choose evil actions. It's not like God is a genie giving you three wishes or three choices, if you will. Give me the ability to speak a fluent language, a foreign language that I choose. Or make me a virtuoso on any instrument of my choosing. Or maybe you can choose to be a world-class athlete. How do you compare those things? Different options, all are good, but they're so different from each other. So hard to compare. Philosophers refer to this as things that don't seem comparable or comparable. Incommensurable. Hard to compare applies apples to oranges. And if God chooses from an infinite spectrum of worlds, it just gets better and better. So the idea is there is always a better world that God would have created. William Rowe concludes on this basis of this tension that if our world is just one of an infinite number of worlds, and each of these worlds increase in goodness, then God does not exist. The God who created this world is possibly morally surpassable. I don't believe that for 1 minute. That becomes the argument for atheism, that God does not exist. This type of thinking is the best fallacy in the minds of most theists who believe in God. Perfect being theology. God is self-existent. God is creator. God is sustainer of all that is perfectly good.